Hello and welcome to another episode of Stay Wild at Home with Wild Things. My name's Luke Strachan, I'm the CEO of Wild Things, and...
Hello! I'm Eleanor Foster, the fieldwork manager at Wild Things. Today we're going to be learning about trees and wood.
Alright, let's go and find some trees, Ellie. Brilliant. So, here we are. We've made it to Wilkie's Wood, which is a beautiful pine forest in the heart of Findhorn.
So this tree here is a pine tree. This particular one is a Scots pine, which is our only native pine in the UK. And in the past, the entire of Scotland would have been made up of Scots pine trees. And that's part of a big forest that would have gone around actually the entire of the Northern Hemisphere. So it would stretch across Russia and Canada. So this part was called the Caledonian Forest, and you sometimes see some examples of some really beautiful old Scots pines. These ones are a bit younger and a bit closer together than how it would have been before. So we can tell it's a Scots pine because it has a kind of orange bit at the top, which you can see in the distance here. It's also got some pine needles. Pine needles come off in twos, so that's distinctive of a few different pines, but particularly of this one. And it's got small little pine cones about like that. The piece of wood for your activity is actually a piece of pine wood, so we'll have a little look at that in a minute. So this is the pine cone from the Scots pine. This is it when it's closed. Inside here are a load of seeds, and what happens is with a bit of hot weather it opens up and all the seeds will come out. It's also the same thing that the squirrels are after, which is why sometimes we find them looking like this. And this one has been nibbled by a lovely red squirrel. All the seeds have gone and all that's left are these tassels.
So, we've ventured deeper into the woodland now, and obviously we're surrounded by trees, as you might imagine, mostly Scots pine. Obviously there's lots of other kinds of plants here. We've got ferns and mosses and shrubs as well. So Ellie, perhaps you could tell us what makes a tree different from other kinds of plants?
It's basically how hard they are. So trees are plants, a lot of them have flowers, but what makes them different is that they have a compound inside called lignin. And it's the reason why this bit in the middle here has not rotted away. It's the bit that makes wood hard. And an interesting thing about it is before trees, plants didn't get as tall, and it's because they didn't have this compound involved. And the tallest plants were actually types of fern, but then about 400 million years ago, the trees developed this lignin, and it actually took almost another 100 million years before the rest of the ecosystem kind of caught up with that and started to be able to break it down. So you can see this one's being broken down. So this tree has died, but is now turning back into mulch and soil. So to start off with, that didn't happen. And instead, all of the trees which grew and died and existed were just there still. And a lot of those got buried, and that became the coal deposits of the Carboniferous period, 360 to 300 million years ago. At the end of the Carboniferous period, what happened was the slime moulds started to break down the lignin in the trees, and all of the carbon dioxide from the trees that was still on the surface got released in one big go, and the climate went whoop, and it got really, really hot on the earth, and it was a mass extinction.
Just to give a close-up, because I'm not sure if you can see it there, but this is kind of an interesting cross-section of the wood, and as Ellie was saying, it's really brittle now. It's really been broken down, and you can see I can just easily, it crumbles away. But as I pull it away, you'll note that there is one bit that seems kind of almost harder than the rest. Could you tell us sort of why I'm getting this circular shape in the centre of the tree here?
Yeah. So this is known as the heartwood. So it's actually inside a living tree. There's a heartwood as well, and it would actually be the dead part of the tree. So it's the oldest bit, and it is pretty solid. Eventually, as the tree gets much older, sometimes this bit does rot away and the living bit remains. So sometimes you get hollowed out trees. But at this stage, it was the hard bit. It might be easier to explain with this. So in the centre, we have the heartwood. Going further out, we start to see these rings. And these rings are annual growth rings, which basically show how the tree has expanded. It just creates a new layer on the outside. What you first get is the sapwood, or the xylem. And the xylem is surrounded by the lignin, which we were just talking about. So it's that really, really hard substance that is a main compound of wood. And the xylem is basically tubes. You might be able to make out. Sometimes you can make out tubes in the wood, tiny, tiny little ones. And they're so, so strong, so they need to get all of the water up from the roots all the way to the top of the tree. So they're really important things and really difficult for us to replicate as humans. So this is the xylem, and around the very outside of the tree would be the phloem, which are also tubes, but they're responsible for bringing the sugars down from the leaves and potentially into the roots. So they work together. And as the tree grows, this shows the kind of basically the wet bit, the winter and the summer, and it shows how the tree has used more water and then used more sugar and used more water and used more sugar. And as that's happened, you've then got new xylem forming on the outside. So eventually it all turns into heartwood as the tree grows.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, on the very outside of that, to keep all the sugars away from all the creatures that might be wanting to eat it, we have the bark. So that's its main purpose, to kind of stop the tree from bleeding out, stop any infection getting into the tree. And it's fantastic for creatures to find their hidey holes in. Lots of ladybirds might hibernate in there, things like that.
And that's a living tree, and I think it's worth mentioning that even just looking at this piece of rotting wood, when I first picked it up, the amount of creepy crawlies that came out of it was quite impressive. There's spiders and harvestmen. Woodlice seem to love it, and of course dead wood is one of the most important resources for insects out there in the world, providing shelter and food for many. And of course that in turn provides food for many other creatures, including birds and the mammals which live in the woodland here too. So hugely important for the ecosystem.
Hello! Today's activity is our Woodcookie coasters. You will have received a Woodcookie in the post, which is made of pine. As we discussed before, you can see the heartwood in this case. You can see the different layers of xylem and the annual growth rings as the tree has expanded. And in these ones you can see a really nice phloem layer, which is the inner bark, and the bark on the outside. We are also going to use the flowers that we pressed before, and they make a really, really nice coaster. These coasters can be gifts, or you can just use them to help remind you of the things that you've seen in the garden or the things that you've learnt. I'm going to use ling, or common heather, and I'm going to write what it is. I'm going to label it up, and that's going to be my finished coaster. Now the reason I'm doing that is it might work as a bit of a momentum to remind me of outside and the fun I've had in nature, even if it's raining or I just feel like coming inside and having a cup of tea for a bit. You can also write something like happy birthday. You could use this as a gift, or you can do anything. I'm going to use a pencil because when we put the glue on top, I don't want the writing to smudge. If you do use a marker pen, make sure that it has fully dried before you put the glue on. Okay, so once we've written that, we make sure that the flowers are placed as we want them to be. And all we do is add a bit of this glue, this crafting glue. We might need to put some on the underside first. There we go. To start off with, the glue is white, but when it dries, it will look really good and it will go see-through, and it will form a kind of protective, waterproof layer over this wood cookie, which means if a drop of tea is spilt on it, it's not really a problem. There we go. So make sure it's completely covered. There we go. And if you want the bark to stay on, you'll need to put a very good layer around the outside. Sometimes the bark will fall off, but if you want it to stay on there a little bit longer, then you want to do this. It's okay if there's a couple of brush strokes. As I said, this goes see-through, but ideally we want as good a coat as we can get. So that means if there's big lumps, you want to smooth them out with the brush. If you are covering the outside, obviously you're going to get a little bit on your hands. That's not the end of the world. Oops, my heather's moved about. So what I need to do is make sure it's in place. And I find that for the flowers, if you dab them, they stay in place a little bit better. And there we have it. So all I need to do now is let that dry. I would recommend leaving it for a good few hours, and it'd be even better if you just left it overnight to make sure it's a really solid coat. If you can see any gaps or anything like that, you can repeat the process, so you can add another layer of glue afterwards. And again, let it dry. And there you have it, a wood cookie coaster.
Well, that's about it from us at Wild Things today. We hope you've really enjoyed your time with us today, and we hope you enjoy the wood cookie coaster activity that you're about to do. There'll be more sessions that we do for you about trees, because there's a lot more to explore. But we hope you've learned something new, and we can't wait to see you again next week. Until then, stay wild at home.